I was told that in the Collège everything starts on time, so probably I should do it. Thank you very much for being here. And I don't know how many of you have heard the name of Gabriel Narutowicz. Gabriel Narutowicz was the first Polish president elected after the Republic got independent. And he was also the short-serving Polish president. He was a president for 5 days. He was 57-year-old. He was an engineer. He was a political ally of President Pilsudski. And just 5 days after he was elected, a right-wing activist, an artist, a critic, saw him on an exhibition and killed him. So first, of course, these days it's difficult to kill a president on an exhibition because he will not be there. But this was one of the very important moments in which illustrates some of the central issue that I want to discuss today, namely the clash between two different ideas of majority that is operating in our political imagination. Namely, the idea of the majority in the way it exists in the nation state, and the idea of the majority that exists in democratic discourse. The crime for which Naturowicz was killed was the fact that he was elected as a president, and back then the president of Poland was elected by the parliament with the votes of the minority parties, basically the Jewish and the Ukrainian votes. And this is why the nationalistic opposition claimed that he cannot represent Poland. I'm saying this because this illustrates a very important type of a clash that I have the feeling is not well articulated in the way we discuss the relations between democracy and the nation state. Namely, and this is particularly true for Europe, and this is particularly true for the nation states that have been born out of kind of the first decolonization, the disintegration of the continental empires, which means that Ottomans, the Romanovs, and the Habsburgs. The nation state was created with the promise of a permanent majority. And by the way, this is one of the paradoxes of why minority rights have been so much introduced in the interwar period when it comes to these young states. Minority rights were not very much popular, and they were not part of the legislation when it comes to countries like Germany or France. But they were very much kind of imposed on the constitution of the newly independent states. And on one level, of course, it was about protecting their rights. But on the other, it was very clear to designate that minorities are minorities. And that basically state is based on the idea of the permanent majority. And this permanent majority is historically rooted. And this permanent majority basically has a language, it has a color, it has a national characteristics. So this was the type of majority for which the critic and the murderer of the first Polish president was speaking about. But there is a second idea of majority. And this second idea of the majority comes from basically democratic politics. And majority simply is the majority that you're getting into your democratic elections. It is not permanent. It is changing all the time. In my childhood, there was a very famous French TV production, which probably you don't know, which was called Barber Papa. And if you remember Barber Papa, it was critically important to remember that it can change its shape all the time. And this is what democratic majority is about. It does not have color. In a certain way, it does not have language. It is very different on the basis of the election results. It is the results of a certain coalitions that comes as negotiations between the parties. And for a very long time, these two majorities coexisted easily under one important condition. The democratic majority cannot change the majority of the nation state. And here we come to the general theme of my course, and like the previous time, following the best Netflix practices, I'm going to try to summarize in 5 minutes what basically I have been talking about in the first 2 lectures, in order basically to be easier for us to understand where my argument goes. So what I was trying to basically claim is that demographic imagination, understood basically as the fear that there are too many people in the world, but too few people like us in Europe, is starting to play a very important role in the way the democratic politics functions these days. And not by accident, the clash between East and West within the European Union is one of the ways better to understand how this type of a demographic anxieties of the publics play out. And the reason is very simple. While we see the demographic decline in Europe in general, in Central and Eastern Europe, the demographic decline is much more dramatic because the low fertility rates are also accompanied by a very high % of out-migration. There was just demographic dates from yesterday. My own country, Bulgaria, for the last 10 years has lost around 600,000 people. Listen, this is small countries. Probably for France, losing 600,000 people does not mean much, but for a country 7.5 million today, this is a big part. This is 7-8% of the population. And secondly, it is not simply that you have the depopulation and basically population decline, but also you have 3 other factors that makes the centrality of this demographic imagination. The first is that you have not simply depopulation on a general level, but you have a strongly depopulation understood in territorial terms. This is not simply that country as a whole is losing population, but certain regions of the countries are basically losing a lot of people. And this is one of the interesting paradoxes in the way also the post-communist transition have never been analyzed. Because if you go to the period between 1944 and 1989, and particularly if you go in Soviet Union in 1920s to the end of the Soviet Union, you're going to see that communism was also very much about managing the movement of people. And one of them was managing the movement of people, moving them from the rural areas to the urban areas for the needs of industrialization. And just to imagine how big this kind of a shift is, keep in mind that, for example, in Bulgaria in 1944, 80% of the population was living in the rural areas. It was different in the Czech Republic and some other, it's not the same all over Central and Eastern Europe, but movement from the rural to the industrial areas was very important, and in a certain way, the nationalization of the land, among everything else, was exactly this. The most important thing that the communist government had to produce after being established was the working class. Because in a certain way, you have a communist regimes in the absence of the working class. And when people these days are looking at some of the big manufacturing production facilities and company towns that have been created all over our countries and seeing that basically the cost of production was very high and they're asking what they have been producing working class. And this was a very important social product. But while you have this kind of almost forced movement of people from the rural areas to the urban areas, and this is a major difference from this point of view between the countries in which you have a total nationalization of the agriculture, like Bulgaria and countries like Poland, where it didn't happen. So if you see how these countries, for example, Romania and Poland, really had a much bigger population that remained in the rural area. At the same time, in the communist countries, there was not a freedom of movement within the countries. This is something that basically people, particularly the generation of our kids, is much more difficult to imagine that within Bulgaria it was much more difficult to move than within Europe today. For example, it was particularly difficult to try to move and start to work in the capital cities. Because there was a huge interest and attraction of the capital to go to the capital cities. So in order to go to Sofia, you need either to marry somebody or to get a very special permission or to go to work in a very kind of a unpopular professions and very unpopular enterprises. So this side of the movement of people was critically important, and one of my arguments always was that one of the reasons for a very strong out-migration that you have seen in Central and Eastern Europe after 1989 was strongly related to the fact that for the whole period after 1950s, movement out of the rural areas was perceived as also as a social promotion. Just moving from the village to the urban centers, nevertheless of what you're doing there, was perceived as basically a social lift. You're getting a social status. Being a worker was much more important than being a peasant. And we saw part of this happening after 1989, where you're going to see, for example, diploma engineers with a very good university education from all of East European countries, starting driving taxis in Paris and London, and they have the feeling that there was a kind of a social promotion for them. The place, the mobility within the space, particularly became important when the social mobility of the vertical type with the end of communism was over. So you have this idea of depopulation of a certain parts of the country that is perceived as extremely painful by people seeing this. I managed in the first lecture to make the argument that this demographic sensitivity was particularly fueled by the pandemic. Because pandemic was kind of an open lessons in demography. The moment the virus arrived, we all have learned exactly how old we are. In order to calculate the risk, in order to get the vaccine, everything was very much age-related. We suddenly understood how many people older than 80s are living in our countries. Suddenly things that normally are interest of demographers because became the interest for everybody else. And plus you have the movement of people. And I have been arguing in a previous book that one of the things that has happened is that because of many things, migration became 21st century version of the revolution, but this time you don't need an ideology, you don't need a political party. You basically need a GPS in order to make the most radical change in your life. Because if you're living somewhere in a developing world, if you want radically to change your life and the life of your family, what for you is more realistic option? To participate politically, try to change the government and hope that the government is going to change the state, or basically to change the state. And this is one of the things that was happening, and of course the size of migration is much lower than basically people normally expect, but the rationale is there. Because the individual was very much empowered because of the information, because basically of the way of traveling, because of the communication revolution. And also keep in mind that the biggest difference when it comes to the actual money that you're going to rely on in your life is based not on the fact of who are your parents, but where you have been born. In a famous book called The Birthplace Lottery, it demonstrates very strongly that the best thing that you can do if you want to help your kids is not to get necessarily a university education, but to give them birth in place like France or Germany or Sweden. This is what is going to be the strongest factor predicting how much money they are going to have during their lifetime. And this combination of depopulation in European Union member states, and as I said, particularly about Eastern Europe, where for the last 30 years, East European countries lost a population equal to the population of the Hungary and the Czech Republic together. Aging of the population, the major movement of people, and also the prospect of people moving. And this is the other factor which I was trying to demonstrate in front of you in the previous lectures. This is not the actual people that are moving. This is the demographic projections that we're living with. For example, there was a famous book in France about how many people of the African origin are going to live in Europe in the year 2040. And the author is an American guy, Mr. Smith. He claims that basically in 2040, around 150 to 200 people in Europe are going to have African origins. Listen, this is projections. Of course, this is based on certain models. This is slightly like with the projection with the COVID-19. You never know if they're going to turn right, but they have a power of their own. They already mobilize imagination of the people. People already start to live in the world in which this has happened. And I was presenting you one more data which I find important for continuing my presentation. And the data was that there were two groups of white Americans. This was a comparable samples. And one of them was given to read the official predictions of the American Census Bureau, which claimed that in the year 2044, white Americans are not going to be majority in the United States. And the other group, which, as I said, the same profile, didn't know this information. And then there was a questionnaire, and both groups should answer questions like, do you support opening of the borders? Do you want to constrain migration? How do you view minorities? Do you believe that they are helpful or dangerous? And we saw very strong correlations between people who have read the census, supportive, constraining migration, and being much more hostile and mistrustful towards minorities, compared with those who didn't know the data. So, as I told you, for me, it was critically important to tell and to make the point that demographic anxiety and demographic imagination has a very, very strong impact on democratic politics, and particularly in democratic politics in Europe. The second thing that I argued is that it is because of the centrality of the demographic imagination, the East-West divide in European Union is particularly important. Because one of the major sources of legitimacy of some of the populist government in Central and Eastern Europe is exactly responding to the demographic anxiety, and demographic anxiety being triggered not so much by migration, but much more by out-migration. This was the paradox of basically of the refugee crisis of 2015. In Central and Eastern Europe, we have a very high level of ethnic homogenization. And this was the result, as I tried to show you on the last lecture, very much of history. This was not on the choice of Central and East Europeans. But what happened was that in year 1900, if you see the ethnic maps of Europe, there were two Europes. One was much more ethnically homogeneous, and this was Germany, France, the Northern Europe. The other was extremely ethnically and culturally diverse, and this was the Habsburg Europe, the Ottoman Europe. And then you have two European wars. You have a revolution, you have expulsion of the population after the World War II. And as a result of it, you have now in Europe, if you see the maps, two Europes again. One is very ethnically and culturally diverse, and this is Western Europe, France, Germany. The other is very much ethnically homogeneous, and this is Central and Eastern Europe. And even in our countries, when you have a minorities, this is a much more historical minorities of centuries. This is not basically a new migrant population, which does not mean that people are not moving. You have around 2 million people of Ukrainians living in Poland and so on, but compared to what you see in Western Europe, the figures are much less. So when I told all this, and this is where the last point in order to finish my Netflix reintroduction, I claimed that when in 1953 the German poet Bertolt Brecht decided to make a satire of the communist government after the anti-communist protest, and he said, if the government does not like the people, probably they should dissolve the people and elect a new one. He was touching on something very important. People elect governments, but government also choose their people. And government choose their people by the way they're designing citizenship laws, by the way they're designing the electoral laws. And the major methodological argument on which my lecture series is based is that in order to understand the difference between liberalism and illiberalism in European Union today, it's not so important to try to see the differences of how they're governing, while there are many important differences, but keep in mind that normatively, these are governments that try to elect two different people. Liberal governments basically much more believe that you need a kind of a more inclusive idea of citizenship and basically of a people which is going to allow people coming from different parts of the world to have the possibility to become a citizens, and from this point of view, you're trying to make the democratic majority much more distant and divorced from the majority of the nation states. And illiberal governments believe that in a certain way, the nation states is going to lose its meaning, sovereignty is going to lose its meaning if basically you have this divorce being realized, and this is why for them, while you're ready to open the markets and allow foreigners to come and to work on your territory, there is no idea that you're going to give them citizenship, and the right to vote is perceived very much as a kind of a national right coming from the origin and from history. So this is the clash between these two majorities. The majorities in the way it was defined by the nation state, and this was very much clear, particularly in the case of East European countries that came as a result of the first decolonization after the European continental empires have been dissolved. And on the other side, that the idea of the democratic majority, which does not have a national characteristics, is something that basically I want to continue. And I'm saying that this is very important, and I was giving this example the last time, is that if you adopt this perspective, you're going to make a sense of a certain things that is happening in different parts of the world that looks slightly strange and amazing. For example, why you have so much contested elections. The example which I gave, and I'm going to repeat, is very much connected to, for example, why President Trump was so much insisting that if these elections are going to be stolen, this is going to be the last elections. From the way the idea of the last elections came. And I tried to argue that one of the strengths of the democracy is that the elections are never the last elections. In a certain way, the idea and the reason why people agree after losing elections to leave power is the fact that first, you believe that if you're going to lose power, you're not going to lose everything. This is not 1944. Your property is not going to be taken out, and basically your life is not going to be taken out. But also, you have a very good chance to come back because people get resentful to power. People basically got disappointed. So being in opposition is the way to go back to government. This logic does not work if you believe that if you're going to lose these elections, the government are going to change the people, and you're going to have a different people. So the major claim of President Trump that elections were rigged is not based on the fact that he believes that there were irregularities so much on the day of the elections. His idea was that the wrong people were allowed to vote. And basically the wrong people were non-white Americans. I'm saying this because starting from this perspective, I'll do something also which could try us to see this if we decide to change the discourse and to change the perspective, to try to show us that something that I'm talking about is not as strange and shocking as we are now looking at it. And my story is the following. Imagine that you're a political scientist that have spent the 1990s in Yugoslavia only. And the only reality that you have seen has been the disintegration of the Yugoslavia, and you didn't know what was happening in the other parts of Europe. Imagine that Yugoslavia is a laboratory, and you are trying to understand what is going to happen in the future of Europe only knowing what is happening on the Yugoslav territory. I'm saying this because in 1993, for the first time, I was in former Yugoslavia as an observer on the elections, and one thing struck me incredibly talking to different parties, but particularly to the governing party in Serbia, then it was the Milosevic party. What makes them particularly furious with all of us going to observe was the fact that everybody was saying that Yugoslavia goes through Balkanization, while they insisted that they are doing Europeanization. And for them, Europeanization was that at last they're going to be a normal nation states on the territory of the former Yugoslavia. So they're going to do what others did in the 1920s, why he said we were very much unlucky after the end of the World War I to end up with this federal structure. And what it means to have a nation states for them was basically to end up with a national community which is ethnically extremely homogeneous. So it was not simply about territorial expansion. The major story was that all Serbs should live in the Serbian state, all Croats should live in the Croat state, and the first identity that was destroyed before anybody else was the Yugoslav one. When the war started, you can be Serb, you can be Muslim, you can be Croat, you cannot be Yugoslav. The only place where the Yugoslav identity survived, in fact, was in exile. You could be a Yugoslav in Paris, but in a way you cannot be Yugoslav in Sarajevo in 1995, because then who are your people? And I'm saying this because the idea during the 1990s, when we have been trying to portray what was happening in Yugoslavia, was very much in terms of deviation. And because Jacques is here, and he was, Jacques Krupnik was the head of the Carnegie Commission on the Balkans. It was very, the major story was what was happening in the former Yugoslavia was something coming from the past. What was happening in Central and Eastern Europe was coming from the future, and the idea was that nationalism was defeated in 1989, with the exception of the federal republics of Yugoslavia and Soviet Union. My argument is going to be the following. This kind of a view of what has happened after 1989 is based on optical illusion. And the optical illusion was very much based on the fact that the idea of the totalitarianism was seeing communism and Nazism as the same. So 1989 was very much, particularly because of the strengths of the German example and because of the unification of Germany, perceived as the second coming of 1945. The discourse was there, and the unification of Germany and all the talk about what happened after the war, the major story was that in 1989 it was not simply communism, but also nationalism was defeated. And listen, for somebody who lives in Yugoslavia back then and who had been living in 1980s in Europe, this claim was going to come as a big surprise. Because one of the interesting stories about 1980s was that for different reasons, both the communist governments in the East and the democratic governments in the West have been very much supporting nationalism in Eastern Europe. In the East, Bulgaria is a classical example. After 1968, the ideological kind of attraction of the communism as an ideology started to fail down. So in many of these countries, basically you start to work for much more nationalistic justification for the governments to stay in power. It was very clear in the case of Poland in 1968 when the traditional anti-Semitic discourse was used, and basically you have the expulsion of the Jews after the students' protest in 1968. For example, in the case of like Bulgaria, this goes through a major kind of a renaming of the Turks and the expulsion of the Turks. So you have governments, we try to say our legitimacy comes from the fact that we are defending the national interest, and the national interest is the interest of the permanent majority, be it Poles, being Bulgarians. Romanian case with Ceausescu is stronger than anybody else. But even in the case of Czechoslovakia and others, which was slightly more complicated, nationalism was very important as the source of legitimacy for the communist governments in the 1980s, when basically the attraction of the communist project was very low, even among the people that before it have been supporting it. But seen from outside and from the West, nationalism was also perceived as a progressive force, because nationalism was perceived as the force for disintegrating the Soviet camp. And you have a lot of support, not simply for the sovereignty of the Poles or the Czechs, but even within the Soviet Union, Ukrainian nationalism, Georgian nationalism, because in a certain way, this was the way, and this was basically the major argument that the communist system is going to disintegrate. So when people then said how nationalism came back in the 2000s and with basically the elections of certain governments in our country, I do believe this is the wrong question. The question is, where have been nationalism hiding in the 1990s in Eastern Europe, and why? And this is the question, because if you see Yugoslavia as your starting point, and let's forget about the war, but keep in mind two things. There is a very the number of genocides being conducted in the world, and Michael Mann is the person who basically wrote this book and who made this research, or let's put it kind of more precise. It is more likely for a democratic government to conduct a genocide than for a classical authoritarian government. This is the historical reality, particularly of democratization, not a classical liberal democracy, but governments that are in a period of democratization. And this is connected to something very important when it comes to the relations between democratic majority, national majority, and all these democratic majority and these demographic problematics. The fear in a democracy is the fear that you're going to be outvoted. Numbers matters always. And numbers, the fertility rates of the other group was important. The fertility rates of the other states. Go back to French history and try to see how many studies you have about demographic trends in Germany versus France after 1871. But what democracy makes different is that if also these people are going to vote, suddenly you're becoming even less inclined to want them to stay in your state. And the major slogan during the Yugoslav disintegration was, why me to be a minority in your state when you can be a minority in mine? And I'm telling this story because when you now look to Central and Eastern Europe, from the perspective of Yugoslavia and from the perspective of what we know happened in the last 10 years, the answer to the question, where has been nationalism hiding, has in my view 3 simple answers. First, it was always there. I tried and went through the surveys from the 1990s in all Central and East European countries, and I didn't see any decline of the nationalistic sentiment. But you're not going to see a very strong nationalistic discourse on the level of the political elites, and if you're seeing the period of European integration, you're going to see that in a certain way it was different discourse that had been dominating. What has happened is that Yugoslav war very much married the strong nationalistic discourse with the position of the ex-communists, and this was the Milosevic phenomenon. So for somebody like Mr. Kaczynski, honestly speaking, he didn't change his mind compared to his 1989. He was there where he was. There was always a very strong national sovereignist wing of solidarity. It is enough to read Timothy Garden-Ash about the Polish Revolution when he was there, and you're going to see that this group was always there. Communism was defeated by the coalition of nationalists and liberals. But in the 1990s, because of the Milosevic effect, the nationalists lost their voice. Because biographically, these people were very much anti-Milosevic. On the other side, the understanding of the state building was not so different. I mean, went beyond the violence of what happened. And you have this period in which this, combined with the fact that the strategic purposes, for the purpose of national interest, integration in NATO and the European Union was perceived as a geopolitical guarantees for the survival of these newly kind of regained sovereignty states. You have a period in which this kind of a nationalistic discourse has disappeared, while the sentiment was there and the possibility to mobilize it was there. And then going from this point of view, it also shows that relations between democracy and state building are more complex than we believed in the 1990s. For example, in 1992, this political scientist who was living in Belgrade and knowing nothing else about what is happening in the world, and if he was a democratically minded person, he could expect that if the end of history idea of Fukuyama is right, Albanian Kosovars in 1992 were going to vote on the presidential elections for the president of Serbia in 1992 for Milan Panic, who was coming with a much more democratic alternative to what basically Milosevic was presenting. But they boycotted the elections. And this is not because they don't believe in democracy, but because they believed in a democracy in their own country. So when you have a clash between the imperative of a state independence and the imperative of a democratic voting, state independence came first. And I'm saying this because what we all very much focused on Central and Eastern Europe and building the European Union and developing the European Union have ignored was the fact that in the 1990s, and it basically continued for more than a decade, Europe was a kind of a big state construction site. more states have been born in Europe after the end of the Cold War than in any other continent, with the exception of Africa in the 1960s and 70s. This period and this kind of tensions between the state building, which were very much perceived as building nation states, with the logic of a permanent majorities, and at the same time spread of democracy and trying to build them as a democratic states with a different idea of democratic majority, is what basically we missed. And then suddenly we discovered that in a certain parts of Central and Eastern Europe, this type of a conflicts that we didn't talk enough about in 1990s are coming back. I'm saying this because there is a very important and interesting book by the Columbia professor Mahmoud Mamdani, which is called Neither Settlers Nor Natives, which give an interesting perspective about this kind of choices and the way we can talk about liberalism, illiberalism today. Mamdani, who comes from a very strong decolonization theory, basically claims the following. He said Europeans tend to view the emergence of the nation state as the result of the Westphalia process, and from this point of view, the emergence of the nation state was very much related to the idea of the toleration. Because Westphalia was about basically tolerating minorities, allowing in the state to have a diverse group of religious communities and others. But he said that for him, the beginning of this process much more should be traced back to the 1492, and two things happened at the same time. The expulsions of the Moors and the Jews from the Castilian Empire, and at the same time, basically, the beginning of the colonization of America. Because according to him, exactly these two sides of the state building came up. On one level, in Europe, in order to be a nation state, you need the idea of a permanent majority, which cannot be changed by the democratic vote. And on the other side, you basically go, and when you start to develop your colonial strategy, the most important idea is not to allow the construction of a majority. Going with different tribal identities, with kind of a different way, particularly when we talk about indirect rule, because the moment when you construct majority, you're basically putting the legitimacy of your own rules under question. And this is an important, in my view, argument for the understanding of some of the crises that we see in the European project today. My colleague in Vienna, the Yale historian Tim Snyder, made 2 points that I find very much kind of useful for developing this argument. First, he claims that one of the biggest illusions in the narrative European Union tells its story is telling that it was created by the nation states. In fact, it was created by failing empires, all of them. France, for sure, but also Italy just losing Libya and others. Germany losing everything because they tried to got everything. But even Belgium, Congo was still there. And then he said the first modern non-imperial states that everybody after it was trying to imitate and to model themselves on were not France because it was empire, was not Germany, but were countries like Greece and Serbia, because it was the first kind of a nation states that came and never were empires. And part of their story, their understanding the ethnic nature of the state and all this was very much coming from this tradition, and why we all the time was trying to see basically this state formation as something that was catching up. In a certain way, this was the first post-colonial states that emerged in Europe, and the moment when Europe basically starts to go with a disintegration of its empires, this was the states that starts to matter a lot. So if this is the case, and I do believe in a certain way this is the case, we can understand why the idea of ethnic homogeneity was so much understood as being so central, first for the legitimacy of the state, and second even for the expectations what a working democracy is. Ethnic homogenization became really perceived as a preconditions of the state being able to create a political community which is cohesive enough and basically can go on sacrifice, on redistribution. American anthropologist Clifford Geertz was the first one already in 1995 in a lecture that he gave in our institute in Vienna to try to push theoretically for us to understand that the end of the Cold War is not only the story of unification, but this is very much the story of disruptions and kind of a splitting. And he said, during the Cold War, the states were hardly pressed to stay together because of the geopolitical conflict. But he said, now when this conflict is not there, we are going to see how volatile and how diverse everything is. And then he came with the two critical questions. He said, now after the end of the Cold War, we are faced with two principal questions. What is a state if it is not a nation? And what is a culture if it is not a consensus? And here comes the major difference between liberal and illiberal answer to this question. On the question, what is a state if it is not a nation, the answer is nothing. In a certain way, the idea that you can have a nation state which is going beyond the idea of a permanent minority that gives historically rooted explanation is something that the governments, for example, in Poland or Hungary are never going to accept. And when Prime Minister Orban lost the local elections for the mayor of Budapest and he was asked how he's going to be in opposition, he said, the nation cannot be in opposition. The clash between these two ideas of majority, in my view, is something very important. And I'm saying this because this type of thinking about democracy and the nation state is something also very much intellectually connected to Collège de France and basically some of the debates coming here. Because if you go back to Claude Lefort and his idea of a democracy as a disembodied society, his idea is democracy is basically the ban on embodying the sovereign. Democracy is a place where basically the place of power is an empty place. And then when you have somebody like Pierre Rosavalon, who is teaching here, who said, listen, people has two different meanings, sociological meaning and abstract meaning. This clash between the sociological meaning of people, which is changing all the time, and basically the abstract idea of a people that makes the state possible is what we are seeing today. And this is, in my view, at the heart of understanding of clash between liberalism and illiberalism in Europe. And this is my other kind of critical argument. I don't believe that this is a clash between East and West. But exactly because of the logic of this conflict, in the clash between East and West, you're going to see the logic of what is the clash within every one of our societies. And here comes a story, because in a classical nation-state idea of the social contract, and Burke was very strong on this, he said this is not only the contract between people who are living today, this is between the previous generations and those who are going to live after us. Here comes the demographic anxiety. We are living in a society in which people are less and less related to the generations that have been living before them. And some of them has the fear that the next generations were not going to be their children. And this creates idea of the political community in which things like migration, political identity, come at the center of the political debate. And this is why my argument was that only if we understand liberalism and illiberalism as a project, two very distinctively different projects of what kind of people we can elect in a situation like this, we can basically proceed and go with this. And here is, and I'm going to, this is going to be my last argument, because on my last lecture I'll try to give an idea basically how these two different projects can also remake the European Union and what we can fear and what we can hope for. But this is the reason why the figure of the threatened majority, the majority ethnic groups that have to have the same fears of minorities, is becoming critically important in European politics. And by the way, this is of course the irony of history. But if you see some of the radical nationalistic voices, both in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe, you're going to see that they adopted the language of the natives. Suddenly, basically, you go with a discourse which was so typical for the anti-colonial movement in Africa in the period, it's not anymore about just the nation, it's the natives. We belong to the place. One of the most popular political thinkers in this tradition basically is the Israeli political scientist and political theorist, Mr. Hazony, who wrote a book about the virtues of nationalism. And his major argument is that human history is not a clash of classes, like Marxist was telling it. It's not the clash between civilizations or religions, what basically Huntington was telling us. For sure, this is not the end of history, what Frank Fukuyama was telling us. The major clash is between the nation states and empires. And for him, the Roman Empire, Soviet Union, European Union, United States after 1990s, all these are empires. And what is a nation state? These are people staying on their land. The only thing, of course, that he ignored, that quite often different people contest the different lands as being their own. But this type of view of trying to view the land as belonging to certain people and states is critically important to understand what is going on. And from this point of view, when people now talk a lot about the models that Mr. Kaczynski or Mr. Orban are following, and when they talk that they're following and modeling their government on Mr. Putin or Mr. Trump, I strongly disagree. By the way, modeling something on Mr. Trump is not easy. Modeling something on Mr. Putin, if you don't have oil and nuclear power, is not easy. The real model is Netanyahu's Israel. And this is a strong and powerful model because paradoxically it comes from the history of East European nationalism. You have a small nation state, economically extremely successful, military very powerful, influential above its weight, but it is an ethnic state in which basically the state belongs to one of the majority groups and at the same time basically insisting of being a democratic state. I do believe this is the story and this is the paradox and transition because while 20th century quite often was called the Jewish century because of the fact that you have this cosmopolitan idea that emancipation can go through the emancipation of the minorities and this is the only way to get their independence, in a certain way this is the Israeli century from the point of view the illiberals see what is the only way for their governments to succeed. So I'm going to end up on this and I'm going to use my last lecture to try to see first how you are electing your people, comparing. Secondly, what are the risks in both of the liberal and illiberal projects. Liberal project has its risks too. But secondly, how they can coexist or not coexist within the European Union. So I want to end up here. I don't know how interesting for you was to spend the 1990s with me, much more seeing Europe from the perspective of disintegrating Yugoslavia than from the perspective of integrating Central and Eastern Europe. But at least what we know is that integration and disintegration quite often are happily or unhappily married. So thank you very much for your patience.